You think you understand power in America until you sit across from the ultra-rich pretending your calloused hands did not build their world. I thought I was just enduring a suffocating dinner for my son. Instead, I shattered a billionaire's empire between the appetizer and the main course. It was never about money. It was about an old canvas coat, the scent of machine oil, and the exact moment a 24-year-old boy decided to become a man. Hello everyone, and welcome back to James' Revenge Stories. Before we begin, I want to share that YouTube has recently disabled monetization for our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue bringing you these tales. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment below. Thank you for your kindness. My name is Valentina Salazar. I am 45 years old, and for the last 3 hours I have been gripping the cracked steering wheel of my old Ford F-150. The heater was broken, blowing only a lukewarm imitation of comfort against the biting chill of the evening. I left the salt-heavy, relentless winds of San Otero behind, navigating the smooth, flawless asphalt that wound its way up into the gated enclaves of Crestview Heights. The transition between my world and theirs was not just geographical. You could feel it in the air. The smell of rusted iron and low-tide brine faded, replaced by the sterile, manicured scent of imported pine and unearned luxury. My hands resting on that wheel are not the hands of a woman who spends her afternoons at the spa. They are rough, calloused, and permanently stained in the creases with motor oil and grease. I am the sole owner and operator of Irontide Marine Works. We restore heavy-duty marine engines and fabricate custom metal for commercial trawlers. It is an empire of spark, sweat, and screaming grinders. I built it from absolute scrap after my husband passed away when I was barely out of my teens, leaving me with a mountain of medical debt and a little boy who looked exactly like him. On the passenger seat next to me rested 2 items. The first was my offering to the prospective in-laws. While other mothers might bring a box of artisanal pastries or a bottle of overpriced wine, I brought something real. Inside a solid mahogany box, which I had sanded and carved with my own 2 hands over the past 3 weeks, sat an antique brass marine compass. I spent 10 hours polishing that brass until it caught the light like fire. It was a piece of my world offered as a bridge to theirs. Beside it lay the real reason my heart beat a little faster. It was an early birthday present for my son Mateo, who was turning 24 in a few days. Mateo was a junior architect, now wearing crisp shirts and carrying leather portfolios. But he was still the boy who used to fall asleep to the lullaby of my welding torch. The gift was his father's old heavy canvas work jacket. It had been tattered and gray, but I had spent the last 2 nights carefully restoring it, rubbing blocks of raw beeswax into the fabric, melting it down with a heat gun until the canvas was stiff weatherproof and smelled sharply of pine sap hot wax and the ghost of the man who used to wear it. I pulled my battered truck into the valet line of Le Ciel. The young valet in his pristine red vest hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking my keys. I stepped out into the freezing air, smoothing down the front of my best but undeniably out-of-season wool slacks. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. The dining room was a sea of crystal chandeliers, muted conversations, and raw silk. The patrons were men in tailored suits and women dripping in subtle old money diamonds. They glanced up as the door opened. I felt their eyes slide over me, registering my sensible shoes, my unmanicured nails, and the slight smell of industrial soap that never quite washes off. They looked away quickly, a polite dismissal, but I did not shrink. I pulled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and walked through that room with the unyielding pride of a woman who knows exactly what her labor is worth. Mateo was waiting near the hostess stand. When he saw me, his dark eyes lit up with genuine, unfiltered joy. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a tight embrace. For a second, everything was perfect. Then I felt his body tense. His smile fractured, melting away into a mask of rigid anxiety. I turned to follow his gaze. Approaching us were three people moving with the languid, arrogant grace of those who have never had to rush for a paycheck. It was his girlfriend, Chloe, flanked by her parents. Chloe looked like she had just stepped off a magazine cover, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, wearing a dress that likely cost more than my entire monthly payroll. The parents matched her perfectly polished cold and entirely unbothered by the rest of humanity. "Mateo?" Chloe said, her voice a soft melodic drawl that carried absolutely zero warmth. She looked at me, her eyes doing a quick, devastating inventory of my appearance. "This must be your mother." The coldness radiating from them was thicker than the winter wind outside. The battle lines were drawn right there in the lobby of Le Ciel, and the dinner had not even begun. The maitre d' escorted us to a secluded alcove at the back of the dining room, a space draped in heavy velvet curtains that seemed designed to muffle anything as vulgar as a genuine emotion. Richard and Eleanor Sterling were already seated, commanding the space like royalty holding court. Richard was a commercial real estate tycoon, a man whose wealth was stitched into the very lining of his custom suit. He had the ruddy, overfed complexion of someone who had never skipped a meal or heard the word no. Beside him sat Eleanor, a philanthropic socialite whose primary occupation appeared to be organizing charity galas while quietly despising the poor. They exuded that specific impenetrable arrogance of people born exactly on the finish line, entirely convinced they had run the whole race. Chloe stood next to the table, offering a greeting that felt more like a health inspection. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was an aggressive, manufactured perfection. It was the kind of flawlessness constructed by tens of thousands of dollars funneled into elite spas, chemical peels, and dermatological interventions. She extended her hand toward me, but it was not a real handshake. She offered just the very tips of her fingers, her wrist rigid. As soon as our skin brushed, she retracted her hand swiftly, a subtle but unmistakable flinch, as if my calloused skin carried a contagion that might tarnish her immaculate manicure. "It is so lovely to finally put a face to the name," Chloe said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetener. We took our seats. The chairs were plush, sinking beneath me, making me feel off balance. I reached into my tote and gently placed the heavy mahogany box onto the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The rich dark wood stood out starkly against the sterile white linen. "I brought a small gift," I said, my voice steady and clear. "A piece of maritime history for your home." Eleanor did not even lean forward. She lowered her chin, gazing at the hand-carved box through half-closed eyelids, as if a dead pigeon had just been dropped onto her dinner plate. She did not reach out to touch it. She did not ask what was inside. Instead, she raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow and gave a barely perceptible flick of her wrist toward a hovering waiter. "How remarkably quaint," Eleanor murmured, her tone devoid of any actual gratitude. "Please take that away and keep it somewhere safe until we leave. It is taking up space for the hors d'oeuvres." The waiter whisked the box away before I could even explain the 10 hours of polishing or the significance of the antique brass compass inside. A cold knot tightened in my stomach, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. Richard took charge of the table with the loud booming authority of a man used to dominating boardrooms. He summoned the sommelier and confidently pointed to a vintage on the leather-bound wine list. He made a grand show of discussing the tannin structure and the vineyard's soil composition, loudly ensuring everyone in a 10-foot radius knew he was ordering a bottle that cost roughly the equivalent of a junior mechanic's entire monthly salary. When the wine arrived, he swirled the dark red liquid in his crystal glass, took a sip, and finally turned his predatory gaze onto me. "So, Valentina." Richard began leaning back and resting his elbows on the armrests of his chair. He deployed a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mateo tells us you run a little boat repair shop down in San Otero. That must be quite the gritty little hobby for a woman." The condescension in his voice was so thick you could cut it with a steak knife. He used the word little twice in one breath, deliberately shrinking my life's work down to the size of a child's sandbox. "It is not a hobby, Richard. I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and strictly professional. Irontide Marine Works is a heavy industrial facility. We specialize in marine engine restoration and custom metallurgical fabrication for commercial fleets. I wanted to explain the complex physics of what we did. I wanted to tell him about the precision required to mill a propeller shaft or the tensile strength needed to weld a cracked hull so it could withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. But Richard had no interest in learning. He only had an interest in conquering. Before I could finish my sentence, he waved his hand dismissively, cutting me off. Yes, manual labor, very noble," Richard interrupted, chuckling loudly. "But what is the scalability there? I mean, you are trading hours for dollars. In commercial real estate, we look at aggressive leveraged buyouts and compounding synergy. We focus on asset liquidity and maximizing the EBITDA margins. If you are not scaling your enterprise, Valentina, you are basically just a glorified janitor for ships." He threw out Wall Street buzzwords like weapons firing off financial jargon in a deliberate attempt to confuse and diminish me. He wanted to highlight the vast, unbridgeable chasm between his world of abstract millions and my world of tangible sweat. Eleanor smiled faintly, sipping her wine, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of her husband dismantling a working-class woman. I did not break eye contact with Richard. I understood his game perfectly. He was not testing my business acumen. He was testing my obedience. He wanted me to lower my head and agree that my world was inferior to his. To my right, the silence from Matteo was deafening. I glanced at my son. Matteo was staring down at his empty porcelain plate, his jaw locked so tightly I could see the muscle ticking furiously in his cheek. Beneath the table, where the Sterling family could not see Matteo's hands, were balled into tight, white-knuckled fists resting on his thighs. His knuckles were practically glowing with tension. When he briefly lifted his eyes to meet mine, they were entirely hollowed out by a profound, suffocating guilt. He realized with crushing clarity that this was not a dinner to welcome his mother. This was a carefully orchestrated execution. His girlfriend's family had invited me here for the sole purpose of humiliating me, to remind Matteo of the dirt he came from, and to force him to choose between his blood and his ambition. The air in the alcove grew impossibly thin. Every clink of silverware, every soft jazz note drifting from the overhead speakers felt amplified and sharp. I sat perfectly still, breathing in the scent of their expensive perfume and the faint bitter aroma of the red wine, preparing myself for the rest of the slaughter. Midway through the main course, the ambient temperature in the dining room dropped sharply. The restaurant management must have adjusted the climate control to preserve the delicate, overheated temperaments of their wealthy clientele, but the sudden chill was piercing. Matteo, wearing only a thin, finely tailored dress shirt, visibly shivered. He glanced down at the gift bag resting against the leg of his chair. He turned his head toward me, his voice low and hesitant, asking if I would mind if he wore his birthday present right now instead of waiting for the actual day. I gave him a warm, encouraging nod. He reached into the bag and pulled out the heavy, weathered canvas coat. The very second, Matteo slipped his arms into those rigid, waxy sleeves and pulled the collar up around his neck. The entire microclimate of our table fractured. The body heat radiating from his chest reacted instantly with the thick layers of raw beeswax I had meticulously rubbed into the fabric. Suddenly, a potent, undeniable aroma bloomed in the confined space of the velvet alcove. It was the unapologetic scent of a working garage. The smell of hot metal shavings, sweet melted wax, and the distinct, sharp, unmistakable tang of heavy-duty motor oil wafted over the plates of seared scallops and truffle risotto. It was an industrial fragrance, gritty and real. It did not belong in Le Ciel. It was a physical invasion of our reality into their perfectly sterile, manicured bubble. Richard, however, was entirely oblivious to the sensory shift. Or perhaps his monumental ego simply overrode his olfactory system. He aggressively sliced into his rare filet mignon, chewed loudly, and launched into a grandiose monologue about his latest, most lucrative conquest. He clearly wanted to ensure I understood the sheer magnitude of his influence, especially since it concerned my own backyard. With a sweeping gesture of his fork, he announced that his firm was in the final stages of acquiring a massive multi-million-dollar luxury marina and resort complex right on the San Otero waterfront. He spoke with terrifying enthusiasm about bulldozing the historic weather-beaten docks. He boasted about how they planned to price out the multi-generational local fishermen, replacing the rugged working-class soul of the harbor with exclusive yacht slips, high-end boutiques, and private helipads. He proudly declared that the profit margins were projected to exceed 300% within the first 5 years. But just as he was basking in the glow of his own financial genius, his smug expression soured. He stabbed another piece of meat and scoffed, complaining bitterly that the entire groundbreaking timeline was currently being held hostage. The final phase of the development, the absolute crown jewel of the entire coastal layout, was completely stalled. "And why is that?" Eleanor prompted, playing the role of the dutiful, admiring audience. "Because of one stubborn, uneducated hillbilly," Richard sneered, taking a large gulp of his expensive wine. He explained that a highly secretive private holding company owned the most critical strip of coastal real estate right at the mouth of the harbor. His acquisitions team had been aggressively flooding them with offers doubling and then tripling the standard market value, but this faceless owner absolutely refused to engage or even counteroffer. Richard slammed his hand lightly on the table, calling the owner a pathetic backward local who did not understand the inevitable march of progress, an idiot clinging to a worthless pile of rocks, rusted scrap, and seagull droppings. As Richard continued to rant, the ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, and the soft jazz music completely vanished from my awareness. The roaring in my ears fell entirely silent, replaced by a crystalline, absolute clarity. I stopped chewing. I took a slow, deep breath. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent, beautiful precision. The mysterious holding company Richard was complaining about, the impenetrable fortress blocking his ultimate crowning achievement, was Coastal Heritage Trust. It was the exact legal entity I had quietly established 20 years ago. Every single time Irontide Marine Works turned a profit, I did not upgrade my wardrobe or buy a luxury vehicle. I bought land. I bought the neglected, overgrown, undesirable lots along the San Otero coastline, piece by piece, acre by acre, year after year. I did it to ensure that corporate vultures could never entirely devour the town that had given me refuge. I was the stubborn hillbilly. I was the uneducated peasant holding the keys to his entire billion-dollar empire. The irony of the situation was so profound, so intensely poetic, it almost tasted sweet on my tongue. A lesser woman driven by ego might have slammed her calloused hands on the table and declared her absolute victory right then and there, eager to watch his face crumble. But I was not a lesser woman. I was a master mechanic. I knew from decades of experience that when a massive machine is spinning dangerously out of control, you never try to stop it with your bare hands. You simply stand back and let it run until the friction burns the engine out entirely from the inside. Instead of exposing the truth, I picked up my crystal water goblet and took a delicate, measured sip. I set the glass down and offered Richard a serene, razor-sharp smile. I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hand, my voice practically dripping with innocent, wide-eyed curiosity. "That sounds incredibly frustrating, Richard," I said softly. "But what happens if this local person never sells? Surely a man of your vast resources has a backup plan for when things do not go exactly your way." Richard practically puffed his chest out, taking the bait instantly and completely. He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that rattled the silverware. "Valentina, please," he said, shaking his head as if explaining a simple concept to a toddler. "Everyone has a price. These small-town peasants always fold when you figure out how to starve them out. We are already mobilizing our legal team to lobby the local city council. We will rezone the surrounding areas, cut off their municipal access, and strangle them with eminent domain lawsuits until they are bleeding legal fees. We will completely bankrupt this little holding company if we have to. They will crawl to us begging for a fraction of what we originally offered." I nodded thoughtfully, absorbing his malicious strategy. "So you destroy them?" I clarified, my tone entirely neutral. even if the land has been in their family for generations. Sentimental value has no place in a high-yield portfolio, Richard stated flatly. It is just business. I sat there breathing in the beautiful, honest, gritty scent of motor oil and beeswax radiating from the coat on my son's shoulders. I watched this billionaire gleefully dig his own grave deeper and deeper with every word, entirely unaware that the shovel he was using belonged exclusively to me. The heavy protective wax I had massaged into the canvas fibers of the old coat was fully reacting to the warmth of Mateo's body. The rich, earthy aroma of working-class survival was expanding outward, pushing back against the sterile, heavily perfumed air of the restaurant. I watched Chloe's perfect, symmetrical face undergo a slow, involuntary transformation. First, her delicate nostrils flared slightly. Then the corners of her mouth pulled downward in a tight expression of undeniable revulsion. She shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her long legs, desperately trying to physically distance herself from the man she claimed to love. For a woman whose entire existence was curated to project effortless grace, the physical disgust warping her features was jarringly ugly. She could tolerate a boyfriend who came from nothing so long as he looked and acted like he belonged to everything. But the coat was a bridge too far. The coat was undeniably, aggressively real. It was a tangible piece of the world she despised sitting right next to her in a Michelin-starred dining room. Unable to contain her repulsion for another second, Chloe leaned sharply to her left, tilting her head toward her mother's ear. It was meant to be a conspiratorial whisper, a shared moment of elitist solidarity between two women who knew better. But anger and disgust are terrible regulators of volume. In her haste to express her contempt, she failed to moderate her voice. In the sudden fragile lull that followed Richard taking a breath from his monologue, Chloe's voice sliced through the velvet-draped alcove with the ruthless precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I told you, look at him!" she hissed, her tone vibrating with a mixture of shame and fury. "He smells like a shop." Time did not just slow down in that exact moment. It felt as though the fundamental laws of physics had simply ceased to function. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The soft ambient hum of elite society, the gentle clinking of crystal goblets, the low murmur of lucrative deals being brokered over caviar, it all vanished. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. At the adjacent table, an elderly woman draped in pearls froze completely, her fork hovering inches from her lips. Her husband, who had been softly swirling a glass of cognac, stopped mid-motion, his eyes darting toward our alcove. A waiter carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes halted mid-stride, turning into a statue against the patterned wallpaper. Every single eye in our immediate vicinity locked onto our table, drawn by the raw, unpolished sound of genuine cruelty interrupting their manicured evening. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It pressed down on the white tablecloth like a physical weight. I did not look at Chloe. I did not look at Richard or Eleanor, who both sat perfectly rigid, suddenly hyper-aware of the public spectacle their daughter had just created. My eyes were entirely locked on the young man sitting across from me. I watched the physical shockwave of those 6 words hit Mateo. It did not register as anger right away. It registered as a profound, shattering realization. The illusion of his relationship, the desperate hope that he could bridge the gap between his heritage and his future by simply loving this girl enough, evaporated into the cold air. Slowly, with terrifying deliberation, Mateo lowered his right hand. He let go of his silver fork. The heavy utensil dropped the last half-inch onto the edge of his bone china plate. The resulting sound was a sharp, dry clink. In the absolute quiet of the restaurant, that single note rang out like a gunshot. It was the sound of a definitive ending. I sat back in my plush chair, keeping my hands resting gently in my lap, my face completely composed. I said absolutely nothing. I did not rush to defend him. I did not lash out at the spoiled girl who had just degraded him in a room full of strangers. This was his crucible, not mine. For 24 years I had poured every ounce of my strength, my sweat, and my love into molding him. I had taught him the difference between cheap plating and solid steel. I had shown him what real honor looked like. Now I waited. I held my breath and waited to see what kind of man those 2.5 decades of relentless love had forged. I needed to know if the foundation I had built for him was strong enough to withstand the crushing pressure of this aristocratic room, or if he would crumble and apologize for his own existence. His dark eyes, normally so warm and eager to please, went entirely black. All the softness, all the anxious accommodation he had carried since we walked through those glass doors vanished. The transformation was breathtaking. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line that looked exactly like his father's. Belatedly realizing the massive social error she had just committed, Chloe panicked. The heavy silence terrified her more than the smell ever could. She scrambled to reconstruct the polite facade, forcing a high-pitched, entirely artificial laugh from her throat. She leaned back toward him, plastering a fragile, desperate smile across her face. She reached out, extending her perfectly manicured hand to stroke his forearm, an attempt to pass the vicious insult off as a playful private joke. The second her cold fingertips made contact with the warm, waxed canvas of his jacket, Matteo reacted. He did not yell. He did not shove her away. He simply pulled his arm back with a swift, violent recoil, severing the physical connection instantly. He jerked away from her touch with the visceral, instinctive revulsion of a man who had just brushed his bare skin against a red-hot branding iron. The rejection was absolute, freezing Chloe's fake smile permanently onto her face. Matteo leaned forward, closing the physical distance between himself and the woman he thought he knew. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried with absolute clarity across the sudden quiet of the dining room. "You are exactly right," Matteo said, his words measured and completely devoid of warmth. "I do smell like a machine shop. That is the scent of hot iron raw wax and heavy grease. It is the smell of my mother's sweat. It is the smell of the brutally hard, honest labor and the clean money that put food on my table and sent me to university so I could sit in a room like this." Chloe shrank back, her eyes widening in genuine alarm. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some fragile excuse, but Matteo held up a single hand, stopping her instantly. Richard, sensing a loss of control over the narrative, decided to intervene. He puffed out his chest, attempting to deploy the same booming, patronizing tone he used to discipline unruly junior executives. "Now see here, Matteo," Richard commanded, narrowing his eyes. "There is absolutely no need to overreact and create a scene. Chloe simply misspoke. You need to lower your voice, sit back down, and remember how to behave properly when you are a guest of this family." Matteo did not sit down. Instead, he pushed his chair back with a loud, grating scrape against the polished hardwood floor. He stood up to his full height. Without breaking eye contact with Richard, Matteo reached over to his left wrist. With sharp, deliberate movements, he unclasped the heavy, diamond-encrusted platinum watch that Chloe had given him for their anniversary. It was a timepiece worth more than a decent car, a physical shackle meant to brand him as their property. He pulled the watch free and let it drop onto the center of his porcelain plate. The heavy metal struck the china with a final, definitive clatter. "I am not your guest, Richard," Matteo stated, his voice ringing with a cold, indisputable authority. "And I am done pretending to be something I am not just to make your daughter comfortable. This relationship is entirely over. I will not spend another second of my life apologizing for the blood in my veins or the woman who gave it to me." He turned away from the table, but before he walked away, his eyes caught the mahogany box resting on a nearby silver serving cart, exactly where the waiter had abandoned it at Eleanor's command. Matteo walked over, picked up the heavy wooden box, and carried it back to the table. He did not hand it to Eleanor. He placed it directly in front of Richard. With a swift click, Matteo unlatched the brass hinges and threw the lid open, revealing the brilliantly polished antique marine compass inside. The brass caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, glowing like a small fire against the sterile white tablecloth. Matteo looked down at the billionaire real estate tycoon. "I am leaving this here," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a sharp, icy whisper that somehow echoed louder than a shout. "You might need this far more than I do, Richard. because you need to find the moral direction you have so clearly lost." Richard's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. His jaw worked silently, completely stripped of his usual arrogant retorts. Eleanor sat frozen, her hand clutching her pearl necklace, while Chloe stared at the platinum watch sitting in the middle of Mateo's unfinished dinner, silent tears of humiliation finally ruining her perfect makeup. It was my turn. I stood up slowly, feeling the satisfying ache in my knees from a lifetime of real work. I reached down and calmly smoothed out the imaginary wrinkles on my wool slacks and crisp cotton shirt. I did not glare at them. I did not offer a parting insult. They were utterly beneath my contempt. I simply looked at the Sterling family, offered them a single slow nod of supreme aristocratic pity, and turned my back on them. I fell into step beside my son. Together we walked down the central aisle of Le Ciel. We did not rush. We moved with the steady, measured cadence of royalty, leaving a conquered territory. As we passed the other tables, the elite patrons of the restaurant parted slightly, their mocking, judgmental stares now entirely directed at the velvet alcove where the Sterling family sat in stunned, defeated silence. We pushed through the heavy glass doors, leaving the suffocating heat of their world behind, and stepped out into the clean, freezing winter night. The biting winter wind whipped across the asphalt as we walked to the valet stand. The frigid air should have chilled me to the bone, but a profound, radiant heat bloomed entirely within my chest. I glanced sideways at my son. Mateo walked tall, his shoulders broad beneath the heavy waxed canvas of his father's coat. The coat fit him perfectly now. I had spent 2 decades worrying if I was giving him enough, if a life built on metal shavings and motor oil would somehow hold him back. But looking at him under the pale glow of the streetlights, I felt an unprecedented, overwhelming surge of pride. He had not just survived the intoxicating lure of their world. He had completely conquered it. The very next morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, I sat at the battered metal desk in my garage office. I poured myself a mug of black coffee, picked up the receiver of my rotary phone, and dialed my attorney. I did not mince words. I instructed him to draft a formal, irrevocable rejection letter to Richard Sterling's holding company. I told my lawyer to make it entirely clear that the coastal properties owned by Coastal Heritage Trust were permanently off the market, regardless of any future financial offers. It took exactly 3 days for the reality of his catastrophic mistake to finally reach Richard. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was elbowed deep in the casing of a commercial diesel engine, a heavy steel wrench gripped tightly in my right hand. The wall-mounted telephone in the shop began to ring loudly over the hum of the air compressors. I wiped my grease-stained hands on a rag and picked up the receiver. "Valentina, please, you have to listen to me," a voice pleaded through the static. It was Richard. Gone was the booming authoritative tycoon who had lectured me about asset liquidity and Wall Street margins. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic, high-pitched, and dripping with absolute panic. His legal team had finally unmasked the identity behind the trust, and he now realized that the stubborn, uneducated hillbilly holding the keys to his billion-dollar empire was the exact same woman he had viciously humiliated over a plate of filet mignon. He babbled rapidly, offering to quadruple his initial bid, promising public apologies, and begging me to separate personal grievances from business. I stood there calmly, the heavy steel wrench still resting in my hand. I let him talk until he completely ran out of breath. "Richard," I said, my voice as cold and unyielding as cast iron, "you spent your entire life believing that everything has a price tag, but you are about to learn a very hard lesson. You cannot buy a spine, and you certainly cannot buy my respect. Have a wonderful life." I placed the receiver back onto the hook, severing the connection permanently. I walked back to my engine, smiling. That following Saturday, I heard the familiar crunch of gravel in the driveway of Irontide Marine Works. I looked up from my workbench. Mateo strode through the massive bay doors, stepping into the dusty, oil-scented air of the garage. He was not wearing a tailored dress shirt or designer shoes. He wore faded denim and the heavy, tattered canvas coat I had given him. A bright, unguarded smile stretched across his face, reaching all the way to his dark eyes. He did not say a word. He simply walked over to the supply rack, rolled up his thick canvas sleeves, and picked up a heavy-duty welding torch. He pulled a protective mask over his face and stepped right up beside me, ready to help restore the massive steel hull of a fishing trawler exactly as he used to do when he was just a little boy. We worked together in comfortable harmony for hours. As the late afternoon approached, shafts of brilliant golden sunlight pierced through the high garage windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes and casting a warm glow over the heavy machinery. The sparks from Mateo's torch flew like tiny, brilliant stars. Standing there shoulder to shoulder with my son, I knew the absolute truth. The true value of a human being is never found sitting behind pristine white tablecloths or inside gated mansions. It is found in a pair of willing hands that are not afraid to work, and in a fiercely honest soul that refuses to ever be bent. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is currently running without any monetization from YouTube. If you found today's story inspiring, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the PayPal link provided in the description and pinned comment. Your kindness pays our hardworking staff, helps them feed their families, and allows us to keep creating these powerful stories for you. Thank you for being a part of our community, and I will see you in the next video.